Hello and welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're making a natural form era Victorian corset and discussing a little bit on how to choose the right pattern for your body. Let's start by taking a look at what is the natural form era. It is the era between the two bustle eras, where the silhouette becomes very narrow and very form-fitting, and there is still corsets and bustles and even crinolines used. It's just that the volume isn't anymore based on that shelf butt that is in the bustle eras. The silhouette is very narrow in the front with very form-fitting hips, and the volume tends to be lower in the back side of the skirt. As for the corset, I'll be working with a pattern from 1877, as it was a fairly curvy pattern to begin with, so it was closer to what my natural body shape is, so I hopefully don't have quite so much adjusting to do. When it comes to fitting your corset, it doesn't matter if you're using a modern pattern, an antique pattern, a pattern taken from an antique garment, or just self-drafting. There are three main ways of fitting it to your body. The first way is the modern way, and that is by taking your bust and hip and waist measurement and basically just making the corset to that and then adding the reduction you want. This is the most difficult one to fit because, or at least in my opinion, because when you reduce the waist, nothing actually gets smaller. The flesh needs to be pushed somewhere. So it's hard to, with this way, it's hard to estimate how much you need to put that that high hip wider than what your natural body is in order to get that reduction. With this method, it's also quite tricky to get that historic silhouette unless your body happens to be the ideal shape for that era. Then there is the way that is more common amongst historical costumers, and that is by taking the pattern in your waist size, the ideal waist size, the whatever size you are going for, and then just using that as is, and then just padding out the pattern where it needs to be padded. This, of course, doesn't work if you're naturally more curvy than the pattern. And here comes the third option, the one that I usually use. I take the ideal waist measurement, the one I want my corset to be in, and then I just look at the pattern, and where it needs to be enlarged, I enlarge it, but I keep the same shape of the original corset so that the shape of the era doesn't change. And the silhouette, even though more curvy than in the original pattern, it still stays in the same shape. No matter which one of these methods you're using, it's important to get a base pattern that matches your body shape. Throughout the Victorian era, the ideal silhouette changes, but even with those ideal silhouettes that usually vary in bust height and the shape and curviness of the hips, there are always several different options for different body types. If you look at period catalogs, you'll see several different kinds of corsets sold. And also, if you look at antique patterns, you'll see patterns for all different sizes and shapes of women. For instance, you'll find corsets sold and patterns sold for stout or not slim women. And they usually come throughout the size range of the waist sizes. So this does not actually mean that they consider a 22-inch waist a big girl. It just means that it is meant for a curvier girl with a softer silhouette that can be more reduced. So there will be a more drastic difference between the waist and the hip than there is in a corset in the same size that is made for a slim or normal body. So what type of corset you would choose basically is based on how much flesh you have and where is it distributed, and also how squishy you are naturally. If you choose a pattern this way, you will have a lot less adjusting and a lot less padding to do, and the silhouette will become still fashionable, but it will be a silhouette that looks more natural to your body. Well, how do you figure out which body type you are if you don't know? Well, start by taking your measurements. We start by taking our bust, underbust, waist, high hip, and low hip measurements and looking at them. What is the difference? Is there a huge difference between these numbers, or is there a small difference between these numbers? Then next, we'll look at your bone structure, the structure underneath all the flesh. Does your rib cage maybe flare out at the bottom? Or does it narrow at the bottom? Is there a large taper? Or is it narrow maybe throughout? Or is it wide throughout? Is there a huge difference between in space between your lowest rib and where your natural waist sits? Or is there maybe a very small difference there? And then look at your hip bone. Where does it sit on your body? To find your hip bone on some bodies, it's not as easy as on other bodies. You want to really squish it in between the flesh to actually find the bone and find the top of the bone. Is it really close to where your natural waist starts from? Or is it much lower down? Is there a huge flare from where it starts? Is it a wide bone, or is it a more narrow set bone at the top part? Because this all affects how much you can be squished and where you can be squished. Because flesh can always be moved around, but bones don't move. Your bone structure stays the same no matter what. Now, after figuring out what shape your actual bone structure is, then we'll want to figure out how squishy you are. And the best way to figure this out if you have never been laced into a corset is by taking your hands to your natural waist and squishing it from the sides and seeing that how much give there is. And how fast does the corset muscles, so basically your core muscles, how fast do they and how hard are they? So how much do you actually compress? And this has nothing to do with actual body size. You can be small or large, you can have a bunch of excess flesh or none, and still there can be a huge difference as to how your core muscles react. It doesn't even matter if your core muscles are in good shape or not. Some core muscles just are much tighter than others. Others compress easily and it doesn't hurt and it's really easy to squish them. And some core muscles, like mine, don't really move anywhere. They're very rigid, so I can't be compressed a lot no matter what body size I am. Okay, now that we have determined how squishy your body is, how much reduction is good for a non-squishy body or a squishy body, of course, varies some from individual to individual, but as a general rule, I would say for a first corset, for a non-squishy person, you'd want to go with an inch to tops a 3-inch reduction. And for a squishy body, you can go for a 3 to 6-inch reduction, but you don't want to go more than that unless you've actually tried the corset on and worn it for extended periods so that you know how your body reacts to it and what feels good on your body. As for no reduction at all, that tends to be the most comfortable for bodies that are, whether they have a lot of flesh or not, where it is more firm and not so squishy, and tend to have quite small natural curves. If you have a lot of difference between your hip bone and your waist, and especially if there's a shorter distance between your waist and your rib cage, it tends to ride up as you move and walk and especially sit during the day if there isn't any reduction. And that can get extremely painful because you can squish that soft fleshy part in the middle, but not your bones. Okay, so now that you know how much reduction you want approximately, how to determine what waist size of a pattern should you use, because all fabric has some give to it. And of course, other fabrics have more give than others, especially like coutil that is made for corsetry, has very little give. But even that does stretch a little bit when it's wrapped around your body, especially because some of the pieces, usually in a corset, are on the bias. I tend to avoid coutil because I have a very rigid rib cage, and because there's so little difference between where my last rib is and where my waist is, and then where again my hip bone is, that I tend to prefer things that aren't quite so rigid. I'm much more comfortable usually in a cotton twill or something else like this that does have a bit more give in it. So what I use is, for example, I have a 28-inch waist naturally, and I usually go for a 25 or 26-inch reduction. once the corset is on. So that's the size I will make my skirts to. So what is the size of a corset that I will use? Well, I usually pick a pattern where when I stretch the tape measure on the actual pattern pieces, it comes out to a 22-inch waist. And using a cotton twill, this usually means that I can either close it all the way or have just a tiny gap, because that's the way I prefer my corsets. Some people like a larger gap, but because I have a bad back, I was in a bad car accident in 2008. I have titanium in there. So my back likes the support, and easily, because there's some nerve damage on my lower back, it easily presses on it if there is a gap between the lacing, so that there's a place where the pressure isn't even. But this is very much a personal preference thing. Some people enjoy a larger gap. It's just a thing that you'll have to kind of try out and see what you prefer. But I would recommend, if you're trying out for the first time and you're ordering a corset or you're making one and you would like to have a wearable mock-up or very little stages to the mocking up process, I would recommend a fairly small gap, maybe 1 inch 2 at tops. And as for lengthening or shortening the torso of your pattern to match your body, first start by familiarizing yourself with the fashionable silhouette of the era you're going for. Look especially at fashion plates, because they have the idealized fashion shape of the era. So even though it's not necessarily a realistic picture, you can, from that idealized fashion plate, easily see where is the ideal shape and size and placement of the bust. So is it maybe a low natural looking bust close to your waist, or is it a little bit higher? Is it maybe very rounded? Is it a more perky bust, or is it even a slightly flattened bust? Once you've figured out this idealized placement of the bust, it is easier for you to determine how far you want to shorten or lengthen the pattern so that you get it to be comfortable on your body, but still keep the bust in the natural position for that time. For my corset pattern, I chose an antique pattern originally published in, sorry, I'm going to butcher this name, De Gracias, I think. Anyway, the Gracias magazine. And it was kindly published for free nowadays online by Frock on their blog. I'll link it down below to the blog post. Anyways, on this blog, I looked at all the patterns for natural form era corsets. So basically from 75 to 82. And I looked at the different patterns and the pattern shapes. And I found one that looked like it was curvy, and the curves happened in a fairly small space, but that was lower on the hips because the part of natural form era that I'm going for, 82, has a fairly long busk, basque, and that is what the bodice was called in that era. So because you have the longer basque, you want it to come fairly low on your hips so that it gives the correct silhouette for that era. I downloaded the pattern she gives on the website, and then I just printed out the first piece of the page, or the first part of the pattern page where she has the scale, and I printed it out in poster mode, and I checked the scale to see how much I needed to enlarge it. If I remember correctly, I needed to put it at 200% to get it to scale up right. And then after I did this, I could print it in poster mode on my printer, and then I could just connect the pieces together as if it was a PDF pattern that I bought online. And now if you're a beginner in making corsets, I highly recommend you make a mock-up first before making the actual thing. I usually, because I've made quite a bit of corsets in my life, I tend to usually make a kind of wearable mock-up so that I use fabrics that aren't super expensive, that I won't be super angry if I can't make work for my body, but that if everything turns out good, I can still turn into a pretty wearable corset that I will actually use as my real corset. And the reason I do this is basically because making a mock-up of a corset requires as much work as the actual corset, unless you're doing a lot of fine finishing details. So I just find it like very wasteful to make a full mock-up if I am fairly confident that I'll get it to work the first time. So now that I have shared all this information that I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please hit that like button because it really does help us creators. Now let's get on to the actual making of the corset.
After printing out the pattern in the correct size, I check it against my own measurements, and the only thing that I need to change is add an inch to the bust. I like to draw my seam allowances straight onto the fabric so that I can see where my stitch line is. The back piece is 2 layers, with boning on either side of the lacing sandwiched in between. Other than the back and the front piece, the corset is single layer. All the seams will eventually be flat felled, but for now I'm just sewing the pieces together so that I can check fit. The front piece is again double layer so that I can insert the busk in. I mark the placement of the busk and where the loops need to come out of the busk, and I start and stop the sewing so that there is an empty spot there where the loops can come out. Then the busk is inserted through the loops and secured by stitching. Then I mark and make the lacing holes and insert the grommets. I always make the holes using an awl rather than cutting to keep the holes stronger. After a quick fit check, I flat fell the seams. I make 1-inch boning channels that I insert on top of the corset. These are made by cutting 2-inch strips on grain and then folding the edges over. You could also make them on the bias, but historically they were both made on grain and bias. It doesn't really matter. The boning channels are sewn on so that on both edges there is room for a 7mm zip tie to be used as boning, leaving a narrow strip in between for cording. The zip ties are cut down to size for the boning channels. The edges are sanded down so that it doesn't break through the fabric over time. Then a doubled up hemp cord is inserted in the middle channel. A 1.5-inch strip is cut for the binding of the corset. Then flossing is added to the bottom of the boning channels. This is both functional as it keeps the boning from sliding around in the channel, and decorative. This can be as simple or as intricate as you want it. I decided to go for a very intricate pattern based on an original. Then a lace trim is added to the top. I like to sew this on last so that it can be easily switched out in case it breaks or wears out. And then I like to add a hook at the front of the corset so that I can put the lacing through this. These are common in antique corsets, and they can be used either for holding your waistbands on your skirts lower or by using your lacing through it. If you tie off your corset in the front, this kind of hook will keep the pressure off the waist and the corset so it won't cause the same kind of wear and tear it would cause if you would lace it tightly around your waist. And here is the finished corset. It is an extremely comfortable corset with a very moderate reduction, giving me a 26-inch waist. I'm extremely happy with the shape this gives me, and though I might at some point revisit this corset and make a more vanity-based one with a slightly larger reduction, I really enjoy this like it is. And note that I have bent the busk to give me that curvy abdomen that was so popular in the Victorian era. Without bending the busk, the front would be much straighter and there wouldn't be that lower belly pooch that really is a trademark of a Victorian corset. Without it, it looks very modern and the silhouette isn't quite right. With this pretty footage, I leave you this time, and I hope to see you again when we make the outer garments for this. Bye!